Hey humans, I'm Teacher Stephanie. This is the second video in an 18-part series entitled What Does It Mean to Be White? Educating yourself on your positionality as a white person and learning a more accurate racial history of the United States. Here, I am publicly better educating myself and hosting a story time with links for further learning, assignments, and places to donate. I hope that you've watched the first video and have done your homework, which can always be found in the bottom of the description box. Last week, we watched the movie 13th, and we thought about a time that we were silent or compliant in the face of racism. I want to emphasize that these videos are not all-encompassing, and we all have the obligation to learn more about these issues. My hope is that by using my experience as a teacher, my access to books, and by situating myself as a learner, we can go on this journey together. Before I begin, I shared in the last video that I related with the dilemma of making myself visible in these videos, but also wanting to decenter myself. One change that I'm going to make is that I'm going to highlight a few people at the beginning of each video that I've learned from in this field, and that I encourage you to follow and learn from as well. For today, I will highlight voices that are active in the current movement. I would suggest following them on Twitter or Facebook. You can also find videos of some of them on YouTube or articles that they have written or been interviewed for. With that said, please follow to listen. This is an opportunity to diversify the voices that you are hearing from, and it's important to come into their spaces respectfully. Use what they share to digest new perspectives. These voices are going to be the most relevant to the Seattle and King County area, but also have connections to themes throughout the United States. The first person that I'm going to feature today is someone named Omari Salisbury. He's a citizen journalist. Along with that, I would also recommend following Converge Media, where you'll often find Omari reporting, and they've been doing the absolute, undisputable best coverage of the current protests in Seattle. I have a lot of respect for their whole team, especially Omari. Sometimes I've gone to bed at 2 in the morning, and his live feed is still going strong. I'd also recommend Africatown Seattle, which is a community group. The next person that I'd recommend to follow is Nikita Oliver. Nikita is an artist, an activist, an attorney, and an educator. I've learned a lot from her, and her voice and critical ideas make me feel empowered to imagine and work towards a better future. The final person for today's video is Jesse Hagopian. Jesse is an ethnic studies teacher, and he's also a writer and has written the book Teaching for Black Lives, which I highly recommend. He's also an editor for the organization Rethinking Schools, where I've bought a number of books, including this one. I'll show you a few of them now. I've also gotten from them Rethinking Ethnic Studies, Rethinking Bilingual Education, Rethinking Sexism, Gender, and Sexuality, and the new teacher book, which I'm very excited to start. And lastly, I'd also recommend that you follow the King County Equity Now Coalition, which is a community group pushing for big positive changes. There are many powerful and meaningful voices out there to learn from, and I'll feature more in each video. For now, let's read the next chapter of our book, What Does It Mean to Be White? By Robin DiAngelo. Chapter 1, Race and Education. The most recent data about U.S. teachers shows that despite the fact that the public school population is becoming increasingly racially diverse, more than 80% of elementary and secondary school teachers are white, from the U.S. Department of Education in 2012. Almost half of the schools in the United States do not have a single teacher of color on staff, and therefore many students, regardless of their race, will graduate from high school having been taught only by whites, from Pecauer, 2009. These racial demographics are not shifting. 80% to 93% of all current teacher education students are white, and they are being instructed by a teacher education profession that is 88% white, from Pecauer, 2009 as well. This racial homogeneity is compounded by unabated racial segregation in schools and housing, and it may be assumed from these statistics that the majority of whites have not lived near or attended school with people of color. have had few, if any, teachers, friends, family members, or authority figures of color, and do not interact with people of color in any direct or equal way in their lives or in their teacher preparation programs. Yet, as evidence in many studies, while most teacher education students live their lives in racial segregation, they believe that racism is in the past, that segregation just happens, that they were taught to see everyone the same, and therefore they don't see color, and that being white has no particular meaning. The overwhelming majority of whites in the teaching field, particularly as classrooms are increasingly filled with children of color and immigrants in a country marked by racial inequality, has profound implications for the role white teachers play in reproducing racial inequality. These implications are intensified by the fact that few, if any, white teacher education students can answer the question, what does it mean to be white? Yet it is critical that future teachers understand racism's modern manifestations if they are to interpret it rather than reproduce it in schools. This book will provide the conceptual framework necessary for the majority of readers to think critically about race and answer the essential question, what does it mean to be white in a society that proclaims race meaningless yet is deeply divided by race? Consider an exercise I use in my teacher education classes, adapted from Nitsa Hidalgo. On the first day of the semester, before I go over the syllabus or talk to my new students beyond introducing myself, I pass out a sheet of paper with the following questions and ask them to write their anonymous reflection. Discuss what it means to be part of your particular racial group. How racially diverse was your neighborhood growing up? What messages have you received about race from your family, friends, schools, and neighborhood about race? In other words, how has your race shaped your life? I tell the students that we will return to these at the end of the semester, pass them around with no names, and read them out loud. But to add another layer of anonymity, theirs will be read in one of my other course sections, and we will be reading another course section's reflections in our class, so nothing they write will be read in their own class. After about 10 minutes, I collect their reflections in an envelope and set them aside. I then tell my class that I'm going to make some predictions about what their reflections say. These are my predictions. You grew up in mostly white neighborhoods and went to mostly white schools. Your teachers were mostly white. Race hasn't shaped your life because race is not important. You believe that people should be judged by their actions, not the color of their skin. The messages you have received about race have come primarily from your family. If your family was not prejudiced, then they taught you not to be prejudiced. If your family was prejudiced, then you rejected their teaching and are now not prejudiced. Perhaps you had a friend or two growing up, or a family member who was not white, or you traveled outside the United States. And that is why you are not prejudiced. If there were a few students of color in your school, they were your friends, or at least no one had any issue with them. Some of you felt that no one should get special treatment because of race, and had programs such as affirmative action in mind. Perhaps you know some people other than yourself who are racist, but you don't approve of that, further demonstrating how unimportant race has been in your life. Many of you found it difficult to come up with enough ideas or interest to write more than just a few sentences. The majority of their reflections will add up to the same conclusion. Race is not and should not be important. My students tell me later that my predictions irritated them because they were correct, suggesting that I can know something about them based solely on the fact that they are white, and thereby poking not only at their racial narratives, but also at their sense of themselves as individuals. The following anonymous student responses, ASR, are representative of most I receive, both in content and length. Students are answering the following 3 questions. 1. How racially diverse was your neighborhood growing up? 2. What messages have you received about race from your family, friends, schools, and neighborhoods about race? 3. How has your race shaped your life? As you read, keep in mind that these students are in their junior and senior years of college and will be going on to be our nation's teachers. Response number 1. I do not believe that my particular race has had much impact on my life. I don't feel that I strongly identify with it. There was only one black family in my neighborhood of 30 plus houses. The message I received about race in high school was very limited. I personally do not think that race is a factor in any way that I live my life. Race is not something that I often acknowledge. Response number 2. My first neighborhood racially was pretty, parentheses, not meaning nice, diverse. These being apartments, you could find different races. My second neighborhood, where I live now, is not very racially diverse. Messages? Not really any. Impact? I don't know. Response number 3. My neighborhood itself is not very racially diverse. However, much of my hometown is. I have always been taught to treat everyone, no matter what their race is, equally. My grandparents have a much different thought than my parents do, and they made sure to bring us up treating everyone with respect. Overall, I don't think race has shaped me much at all, because it doesn't really matter to me. When I look at someone, I do not see the color of their skin, but rather the person that they are. Response number 4. My neighborhood was not racially diverse at all growing up. Maybe freshman year of college was when diversity appeared, yet still very small. I'm not sure how race shapes my life. It seems similar because I am white, and I feel like I'm constantly hearing racial slurs or people using the race card, that it just makes me thankful for who I am, and don't have to deal with that. Response number 5. Growing up, my neighborhood was not that diverse at all. Basically, almost everyone was white, with no other backgrounds. I honestly don't think about my racial group too much. I try not to discriminate against people of another race. Where I work, however, we have a lot of diversity. People speak more than one language, come from different countries. I found it very interesting, and since I've been there for so long, I am used to it. Even when I first started, I never felt weird or anything. In school, we were taught to never discriminate and learned about different cultures. I taught in an education program that is 97% white, and it was rare for me to have any students of color in my classes. Thus, this typical insistence that race doesn't matter comes from white students sitting in an all-white classroom who grew up in primarily white neighborhoods and attended primarily white schools and are currently being taught by a virtually all-white faculty, including me. These racial realities testify to a society separated by race. Yet, how do so many white people manage to position race as meaningless, even as we live, work, study, love, and play in racial separation? Further, this separation is not benign. Racial disparity between whites and people of color is measurable in every area of social life: health, income, net worth, educational outcomes, criminal justice, infant mortality, and life expectancy. If race is meaningless, how do we explain that separation and disparity? My students' answers, which are the same answers I get regardless of where I ask the question, schools, workplaces, social gatherings, or the age of the participants, indicate that the vast majority of whites are racially illiterate. Of course, we don't realize that we are illiterate because we have been taught that these are the correct answers to questions of race in public. What we say about race in private will be discussed later in the book. But I use the term illiterate because we are only able to articulate the most predictable, superficial, and distorted understandings of race. Most white people have never been given direct or complex information about racism before, and often cannot consciously recognize, understand, or articulate much about it. I open each chapter of this book with excerpts from my students' responses in order to illustrate a point. People of color are generally more aware of racism on a personal level, but due to the wider society's silence and denial of it, often do not have a macro-level framework from which to analyze their experiences. Further, dominant society assigns different roles to different groups of color, and a critical consciousness about racism varies not only among people of color within groups, but also across groups. For example, many African Americans relate having been prepared by parents to live in a racist society. While many Asian heritage people say that racism was never directly discussed in their homes. From Hooks, 1989, and Lee, 1996. While this book focuses on white racial socialization, it may be helpful to people of color because so much of the experience of a person of color in this society is predicated on adapting to the ways in which whites understand and perform race. Returning to the exercise at the end of the semester, we gathered in a circle, and I passed around another section's reflections. We each read one aloud. My predictions all came to pass, with a few variations. Occasionally, a white person will acknowledge that whites have benefited from a system that privileges them or admit to holding some racial stereotypes, and depending on whether there are any students of color in the group. Students of color rarely say that race has no meaning in their lives. But now, my students could see that the way that white people conceptualize race plays a key role in how racism flourishes. At this point in the course, many students were better equipped to critically analyze the fundamental question addressed by this book: how the vast majority of whites can live in racial segregation even as we insist that race has no meaning in our lives. They had also begun to see what is required of them if they want to change these dynamics. In short, they have gained some degree of racial literacy. My goal for this book is to take my readers on that same journey. Speaking as a white person to other white people, and within the context of the United States, I will explicate how we are able to position racism as something that happened in the past, at the same time that so many of us live in racially segregated lives today. I will also address why it is urgent that we understand and can identify current manifestations of racism, starting with a framework for understanding racism as a system of unequal social, cultural, and institutional power, rather than individual acts of prejudice. I will take my readers through an analysis of white socialization. I will provide a conceptual framework for understanding the power of race in our lives, and information on the skills and perspectives needed to build cross-racial awareness in a society that is deeply segregated at the same time that it is positioned as post-racial. Some may ask why white people need to develop racial literacy, when these simplistic answers clearly work for us and allow us to be comfortable in the face of so much racial inequality. One important reason is that our illiteracy limits our intellectual, psychic, and emotional growth. From Bonilla Sylvia in 2009. Documents a manifestation of white racial illiteracy in his study of colorblind white racism. He states, because the new racial climate in America forbids the open expression of racially based feelings, views, or positions, when whites discuss issues that make them uncomfortable, they become almost incomprehensible. I don't mean, but... Page 68. Probing forbidden racial issues results in verbal incoherence, digressions, long pauses, repetition, and self-corrections. Silva suggests that this incoherent talk is a function of talking about race in a world that insists that race does not matter. This incoherence is one demonstration that many white people are unprepared to engage, even on a preliminary level, in an exploration of their racial perspectives that could lead to a shift in their understandings. However, an assertion that whites do not engage with dynamics of racial discourse is somewhat misleading. White people do, of course, notice the race of others, and do invariably mark it. Quote, the Asian teacher. We also discuss race somewhat freely among ourselves, albeit often in coded ways. But our refusal to directly acknowledge this race talk results in a kind of split consciousness that leads to the incoherence Bonilla Silva documents above. This denial also guarantees that the racial misinformation that circulates in the culture and informs our perspectives will be left unexamined. But most importantly, this lack of preparedness results in the maintenance of racial inequality. For if whites cannot engage in an exploration of both their own and people of color's racial perspectives, we hold the racial order in place and continue to impose our racial perspectives and experiences as universal. This imposition works to obscure the workings of race in our lives, leaving us to explain racial segregation and inequality in ways that blame and punish people of color. The continual retreat from the discomfort of authentic racial engagement in a culture infused with racial disparity limits our ability to challenge racial inequality and results in a perpetual cycle that works to hold racism in place. Perhaps, most profoundly, racial illiteracy prevents us from building and sustaining authentic relationships across racial lines. That was the first chapter of What Does It Mean to Be White? Developing White Racial Literacy by Robin DiAngelo. I'd like to remind you to please check the bottom of the description box for your homework. Until next time, thank you for learning with me.